Good afternoon, everybody. It is Wednesday, although this will be coming out on Thursday. I'm Ian Pad. I'm the peacemonger, and today I want to talk about something that doesn't really get much attention, certainly not in the mainstream media here in the UK, possibly more so in the US right now, is the issue of social conservatism. And I'm joined by Andrew Collingwood from the very popular multipolarity podcast. He's the black square because he's not able to access his camera today. So he is there, live and kicking. And I've spoken to Andrew before on his podcast with Philip Pilkington, talking polarity, but Andrew's also a supporter of the Social Democratic Party in the UK. Little known, it was mainstream in the 1980s, kind of disappeared from view. It's made a comeback again, possibly as mainstream politics is losing its luster, I think, for increasing numbers of voters. So I want to talk to him about that. I mean, I don't, for transparency, I don't really belong to any mainstream parties. I think they're all rubbish, really. And I probably spent too long focusing on other countries' governments as well, which may also be a factor. But Andrew, welcome to the show.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here, sir. Thank you very much, Ian.
And Andrew and I also share common heritage because we're both, I mean, might not sound it, but we're both kind of from the Northeast, or at least I'm half from the Northeast. My dad was from the south of the Tyne, Andrew's from the north of the Tyne, but we both
Yeah.
share that kind of heritage as
You
well. So
you've
that's
lost
really
even
nice
more
to
of the
know.
accent than me, Ian. That's
I'm not sure everybody had the accent, but well, my dad still does. He's 86. He does still have a bit of the accent, and and I've got a novel coming out in the summer where the lead female character is actually a Geordie. But anyway, more on that later. So, what is social conservatism, Andrew? And do any of the mainstream parties have anything to say on it right now?
I don't think that's necessarily an easy question to answer. I mean, the most obvious way to answer what is social conservatism is to say that it is in opposition to something. So in the 18th century and part of the 19th century, it tended to be in opposition to liberalism and the concept of liberalism, whether that be the divine right of kings earlier on, or nationalism and liberal democracy later on. Then it shifted to being in opposition to ideas that derived from the philosopher Karl Marx. So that meant communism, socialism, and it very much became an anti-communist creed in the second half of the 20th century for obvious reasons. And then in the 21st century, it's tended to define itself as being in opposition to what we might call wokeism or political correctness or any of the fashionable kind of liberal progressive ideas that hold so much sway in especially the Anglosphere, but in the broader West in general. So I think that's one way to answer the question, is to say that social conservatism is always in opposition to something. I think it was the American journalist William Buckley, Golden Man at Yale, who said that the job of the social conservative was to stand athwart history and yell stop. I think though that is a little bit unfair, and it doesn't really do justice to social conservatives. I think that the social conservative, certainly in the 21st century, has a positive vision of the future. It's not always backward looking. It's not always just a curmudgeonly resistance to progress. I think it has also something positive to say about the future. And it does so by drawing on traditions, on religion, on social convention and social mores, on shared loves and the bonds that bind us as communities. It draws on families and communities itself. It draws on our environment and our countryside and our natural world. And it says that these things are valuable, they're worth protecting, and it is important to protect them. And I think that the modern social conservatism would also say that we would need a rethinking of the social contract. So instead of being about something that is agreed almost as a literal contract between the government and the individual citizen, it would be more of a shared responsibility that, you know, our fathers bequeathed us something of great value, and we have a duty and a responsibility to maintain that and leave it in just as good a state so that our children might benefit in the same way that we did as our father's children. And I think that that is something that is a much more positive message for the social conservative.
Yeah, so in a way, it's more of a two-way contract. It's between two parties, but citizens have responsibilities as well, which kind of moves us on from the idea of a nanny state where you know uh, the ruling class govern and citizens receive and become increasingly dependent upon the state, if you like.
Well, yeah, and I think insofar as there is a contract within a social contract that a social conservative would recognize, it's the kind of the Burkean concept that the contract is between the dead, our ancestors, and those who are yet to live. That's where the contract lies, and it's not necessarily just between the government and the citizen itself. And as you rightly say, the social conservative would be very much in favor of things like self-reliance and thrift and saving, and pruning the garden, so to speak, when it came to our natural environment. For instance, I think the social conservative would have much to say about green issues, but it would be very different to that which a liberal progressive would have to say. But there is some kind of synthesis there between the two of them. So yes, I do think that all of these things are important, but I also think it's been difficult to define what social conservatives have to say, or what is social conservatism, because it's become synonymous since the 1980s. It's become synonymous with a kind of right-wing liberalism, I would say. It's become synonymous with the politics of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. It's become synonymous with the philosophy and economics of Friedrich Hayek. And I'm not sure that's exactly what social conservatism is. It is to a certain degree that, that has much, of worth to give us and to teach us. But I think in its modern sense, it's simply become right-wing liberalism. And I believe that that's one of the difficulties that social conservatives have when it comes to presenting their messages.
Yeah, and I think the SDP actually positions itself on the centre left, if I'm not actually mistaken. And I like the idea of standing athwart history, and because if there's a reason why the SDP has returned now, it does seem to be that somebody needs to say stop, and not just in terms of our approach to domestic policy, but of course uh, in our approach to foreign policy. So there is a future to bequeath people who are yet to live. It seems to me. Um, but I
Well,
think there's a
exactly
bit.
so. I mean, we're in that at that point where that might be in question at the moment. So that is an important point. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I mean, I think it's timely. It's also timely because at a time when I think all of the mainstream parties, the Lib Dems, even the SNP, if they're called mainstream, the Tories and the Labour Party, all kind of losing their luster, there's not really very much occupying the left. There's a very contested far left space. You could say the Greens are actually occupying that better than Jeremy Corbyn and his lot. Um, but the former appears to be very, very resurgent, right now. At least it seems to me. I mean, the Tories bleeding MPs left, right, and centre. At the moment, because they're seen as a busted flush. But that has yet to happen to the same extent, with the Labour Party. And I think that's a sort of that's a kind of momentum. It seems to me that SDP needs to build, but it needs to have a clear idea of what it stands for to be able to to do that. And I think to me that standing in thought history is standing as a counterpoint to neoliberalism. In terms that's in terms of how I interpret it anyway.
Yeah.
Particularly, I mean,
So
I think more about foreign policy than domestic policy, but it applies, both ways, of course.
what I think how I think the SDP would describe itself, certainly how the leader William Clouston would describe it, is as economically left of centre, and socially conservative and traditionalist. So it would be a kind of a conservative left-wing party. It would draw from people, figures from the past who were socially conservative left-wingers, people like Peter Shaw, people like James Callaghan, Gateskill. These sort of figures before before the Labour Party was Blairite and entirely neoliberal economically and socially progressive socially. The Labour Party was a kind of balance between the social conservative left, which was often drawn from very working class communities, drawn from Methodist Christianity and Catholic Christianity. There was very, very powerful and deep roots of Christianity within the Labour Party. And that was always balanced with kind of liberal left-wingers, people like Roy Jenkins and Anthony Crossland, who had, views that we might consider as kind of proto-Blairism, if that makes sense, although they were intellectually far superior to, Tony Blair or anybody who he worked with. I would say the SDP draws from that conservative wing of old Labour, while at the same time not being socialist as they perhaps were. So it does believe in things like nationalizing electricity and the train system, but it doesn't believe in equality of outcomes. It doesn't believe in a kind of 90% tax rate. It believes in the private sector's rightful domain in generating wealth, but it also believes in the public sector's rightful domain in managing the common good, things like electricity, things like water. I would say though that
were the wokeism and the warmongering.
yeah, absolutely. So I think there are probably a small faction of the Lib Dems who would be better off coming home to the SDP, right? Like that's they would be better off doing that. Equally, there are members of the Lib Dems who would be better off going to join the Green Party, and there are members of the Lib Dems who would be better off joining a kind of absolutely. I mean, like. Yeah, so I mean, the Orange Book liberal Democrats, the proper old-fashioned hardline liberals, I would call them, would be better off joining Farage. So those guys would be at home there with a Thatcherite and a socially liberal Thatcherite. I think that the sad truth of British politics at the moment, though, Ian, is that there is no, as far as I could see, apart from the Social Democratic Party, there is no socially conservative party. There are a lot of left-wing liberal progressives, the Green Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, Corbyn's party, right? Like all of these are, left-wing liberal progressives. There are some right-wing liberals, or right of centre and right-wing liberals, and that would be the Conservative Party and Reform. But there's no actual social conservative party. There's nobody who believes in a kind of a British version of Gaullism, the sort of ideas that people like John Gray, the conservative philosopher, or Roger Scruton, the late conservative thinker, or Peter Hitchens, the great battle axe conservative columnist in Britain. There's nothing that they could get behind as proper serious social conservative policy. So I think that's where the Social Democratic Party does have a potential in the future. And actually, if you look at opinion polls, the average Briton on economics is more left-wing than the average Labour Party MP, or they were before Labour started getting more into nationalisation. But they're more left-wing than the average Labour Party MP. But they're more right-wing socially than the average Conservative Party MP. And that's the true centre of British politics now. It's not a milquetoast kind of watery potato water blend of Cameronism and Blairism. It's like this: a left wing economically, right wing socially. That's where it lies, and I think that's where the big gap is. And on a Pepsi taste challenge, if any of your listeners are old enough to remember the blind Pepsi taste challenges, where people tried different colas on the street, and they all discovered to their shock that they preferred Pepsi to Coca-Cola. Other brands of cola exist. I think the SDP would actually win the next election by a landslide. It would win probably somewhere between 50 and 55% of the vote. If you didn't know who the party was and you just picked on policies, the SDP would win between 50 and 55% of the popular vote. And what was left would be for all of the other parties to divvy up between them. But it's a small party. It has no money. So its success is more about its influence at the moment, its influence on other thinkers. As an aside, and I know I've drawn on a bit, so I'll make this the last point. You, as a kind of a joke, and it is a joke, and it is delicious. Schadenfreude noted that the Tory party looks on the verge of breaking up. People are MPs are defecting by the second, it seems. I think that Labour's position is actually secretly beneath the surface even more vulnerable than the Conservative Party's position. And the reason I say that is because both UK political parties, or both of the main ones, the Conservatives and Labour, are what I would call pre-election coalitions. So in Europe, they have proportional representation, and it means you have an election, and then after an election, you have this process of forming a coalition to form a government. In Britain, as in American congressional elections, we have first past the post. And that means that what happens is the coalitions form before the election within the two great parties. And the coalition of the Conservative Party was always your kind of right of center liberal progressives, the Cameron wing, which was basically Blairism with slightly lower taxes. And the other coalition was the kind of the harder line Thatcherite group. And we're now seeing that break up. And the Labour coalition, though, is even more vulnerable because that's the kind of the student Trotskyists. And it's also the Blairite wing. And I think that's even more vulnerable to break up with the rise of the Green Party and to a certain degree the Lib Dems.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of struck a chord there. I mean, the basic problem is all the mainstream parties look basically the same. Certainly on foreign policy, where they're exactly the same. At least it seems to me. And nobody's yet put a stake in the ground with a new vision. I mean, politics lacks vision. It's a catastrophic lack of vision in UK politics. And the policy process itself, it seems to me, has become so desperately tactical and pulled in the direction of niche interests that is alienating and disenfranchising ordinary working class people. And most working class people actually work, and as you say, are probably socially, to the right and economically, to the left. But I think, the wokes in the centre, if you want to call them that, who conflate working people and people who sit within an ever-growing dependency culture, at least it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the ever-growing dependency culture, what people on the left, on the economic left, don't quite understand is that it's the working class communities and the low and the lower middle class communities, in fact, where the criticism and the dislike of dependency culture is harshest and toughest. Like if you go to my mum or my dad's estates, both of which are social housing or council housing or whatever you want to call it, the criticism there of anybody who is like, lolling around on the dole is ferocious. It's nothing that you would ever see from like a proper middle class suburb. Okay. Like if you had a party that really tackled that kind of dependency culture, it would be phenomenally popular within the working class, far more so than within the middle class. It's quite an unusual thing that the Labour Party tends to draw most of its support from the working class communities, but it kind of ignores them when it comes to things like drugs and criminal justice and benefits fraud and benefits cheating or like work in the benefit system. I'm not sure how you would put it. Like the difference between tax avoidance and tax maximization. You have that outright benefits cheating, and then a kind of a benefits massaging and manipulating. But that's really unpopular within the working class communities, and I think it's something that's not recognized. On foreign policy, look, David Goodhart, the journalist and author and kind of political thinker in Britain, he used to be I think the founding editor of Prospect magazine. David Goodhart coined this phrase, double-barreled liberalism. And it was to describe the fact that since the war in Britain, the elites have foisted both social and economic liberalism on the population. I would say that there's a third liberalism, though, and it's actually the hardest to shift. And the third liberalism is foreign affairs liberalism. It's this idea, this concept that what is important is to make all countries liberal and democratic, to have them all open their capital and their trade accounts, to make them all privatize their business, their natural resources and their utilities and their public goods. It's to ensure that they all pursue socially liberal and socially progressive policies. It's to make sure that they all sign up to these kind of international treaties and quite often to international legal arbitration of even internal affairs. This kind of concept, this idea that we would all be safer and all be more prosperous if we did that, if everyone signed up to this kind of the new American century as conceived by people like William Crystal and Charles Krauthammer and this kind of neoconservative brand in the 1990s in Washington. And that's manifestly failed. Like it's just failed abysmally. The world is a more dangerous place now. The meddling that was necessary has made the world more volatile. It's created a kind of an arc of bloody chaos from Tripoli to Kabul, right across the Middle East into the Hindu Kush from North Africa. It's created as geopolitics 101 would have said to begin with. It's created a kind of challenging kind of loose alliance and challenging powers who do not want to be meddled with and interfered with in this way. They want to be able to run their own internal affairs as they see fit. And it's made us all poorer. The problem is that the thinking, the intellectual, like a lot of people recognize things like the Iraq War was an error. Fewer people recognize that the Afghanistan war after the initial invasion, perhaps, was also a horrible error, this 20-year occupation. Many people recognize now the Libya operation as an error. Few people that I speak to these days even recognize that actually our intervention in Kosovo and Serbia has solved absolutely nothing in that region. And yet, nobody, even those who recognize all of these failures, nobody has changed their intellectual framework. Nobody has thought, well, in the "No Country for Old Men" famous phrase, if the rule that got you here has led you to this, what use was the rule to begin with? Like nobody has thought, if the intellectual framework that led us to intervene in Iraq, intervene in Syria, intervene in Libya, intervene in Somalia, like if that intellectual framework was what led us to that, then maybe we should address that intellectual framework. And yet, when the next international conflict comes along, the same people make exactly the same arguments. For economic liberalism, there are people even in the House of Commons who disagree with it, and certainly in the US Congress. For social liberalism, there are fewer people in the House of Commons that disagree or counter against it. People like Danny Kruger, for example, would be one. Miriam Cates would be another before she lost her seat. In the US Congress, there are far more real social conservatives. But there's nobody at all in Britain, as far as I can see, no major figure who is against the foreign policy liberal idea, the concept, what we might call, there's no JD Vance.
No,
there's no Pat Buchanan.
Although he's kind of losing his luster a bit, I think lately. I mean, my view is that the nexus between foreign policy and domestic policy, there's a common thread. Even though liberalism talks about the inviolability of the individual and free choice and all the rest of it, ultimately we're in a system that's rooted in the 18th and the 19th century sort of system of gentry and monarchy, and we want to govern people. We want them to be dependent upon us, we want to kind of dictate how they live their lives, really, and that applies equally to foreign policy. Certainly, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, the kind of the zones of conflict that you've mentioned, but also in terms of the welfare state. I mean, I think actually you need to kind of flip the telescope a bit and ask yourself whether, in fact, the people at the top of the pile, in terms of the political elites who swan around Westminster, never really having had a proper job, having felt hunger or faced kind of real danger, they actually kind of like the fact that people are dependent. They think it's a vote winner, and the policy open window is so narrow that they don't want to change it anyway. And as it relates to people outside of the board as well, they're all just unwashed heathens anyway, and we just need to convert them to our very British, very snobby way of doing things. And I think I look back at the evolution of democracy in the UK. It was great when the franchise was opened up to women, and that was great too. But that happened in a historical context where people still felt inferior to the people governing. So that culture, the 18th and 19th century culture, rooted in gentry, still persisted. But in the 21st century, it's harder to maintain that. Because everybody has access to information and can develop their own ideas. I think that is a real challenge to the political elites. And nobody is kind of seizing the initiative at the political level to reach out to those people with a compelling vision of the future rooted in socially conservative, ideas. At least it seems to me.
Well, I think there's, if I may say so, there's an even more fundamental issue with liberalism itself. I think John Gray, and I think it was Black Mass, his great work said that liberalism is connected intellectually with some of the strains of Marxism, and probably Marx himself. And like Marxism or communism or whatever you want to call it, it is an expansionary concept. Logically, it can brook no competitor. So you will hear, for instance, liberal progressives saying that they're tolerant of everything except intolerance. And what do they mean by that? Well, they're tolerant of everything as long as it's not people who disagree with them fundamentally, because they are the people for whom they say are intolerant. So, to take one example, they're tolerant of they're tolerant of every form of marriage. It might be homosexual marriage, it might be polygamous marriage, it can be any form of marriage. Yet they will say that they're intolerant of those who think a marriage can only be between a man and a woman. Now, for full disclosure, I think there is in the modern world a socially conservative argument to be made for the legalization of homosexual marriage, and it would be one that I would probably support in modern Britain for various reasons. But I say that just to illustrate the point that liberalism is becoming increasingly, now that it is entrenched in the higher reaches of British political life, and by that I mean the levers of power rather than just the political, being a number 10 or having a majority in parliament. It's becoming increasingly aggressive in terms of what it will not tolerate. Okay, and I think, I think Wolfgang Streeck, the German left-wing philosopher, was very good in pointing out that in the same way that liberalism is becoming increasingly disdainful or increasingly open in its disdain, as you quite rightly put it, for the unwashed masses, what they call in Britain the gammons, the kind of the shaven-headed, sunburned, working-class fella in the England football jersey. They're becoming increasingly open in their disdain for them, and they see their duty as a kind of Manichaean effort to defeat these people in the name of all that is right and enlightened and good in the world. So foreign policy to them is a mirror image. So in the same way that it is the populist at home, the Donald Trump, the Marine Le Pen, the AfD in Germany, the Nigel Farage and the rest of the populists in Britain. So abroad, it's Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and people of that nature. There's a direct
Yeah.
correlation in the way that they see the world internationally and the way that they view domestic politics as this Manichaean struggle between good and evil, where there can be no compromise, there can only be victory.
Yeah. No, no, that's right. Although I tend to reject the term populism as it relates to politics, or at least as it relates to the conduct of democratic elections, because the electoral process is by its nature populist.
Oh, of
You know,
course it is. Of course.
people put forward ideas, and the most popular ideas win. And when the Labour Party first came to power, that was on the back of a very clear vision of what it wanted to do, and that was to kind of help working class people improve their lives, and they introduced the welfare state and all the rest of it, which at that time was of course a very very good thing. But nobody really knows what anybody stands for now, apart from standing for themselves as individuals. We've become so individualized. Although people still adapt themselves to kind of fit within the curtilage of the Westminster Club, and wanting to belong to that. But everything now is about the individual, and it seems to me, and this idea of personal responsibility and responsibility to others and to the community has been eroded. And I think partly that's something that is behind, to a certain extent, the groundswell of support for parties outside of the horrible, bland, patronizing middle which characterizes mainstream politics.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the huge problems in Britain now is there's a lot of I and not very much we. There's a lot of my rights and what I am owed, and there's very much how can we do this together, right? Like that's a huge problem. But I think that's been a deliberate process to create that. After the war, people were quite rightly horrified at what had happened. Germany is a developed and civilized country, and the feeling was, if something as truly ugly, something as manifestly evil from the kind of the pits of the darkest corners of humanity could take root in Germany, then my God, it could take root anywhere. I mean, this was the nation of Goethe and Beethoven, for goodness sake. So I think there was a deliberate effort, and I don't know if you've ever read The Return of Strong Gods by R. Reno, but it's a fantastic book that outlines the process. And Rusty Reno basically argues that there was a deliberate effort based on the ideas of Karl Popper, who wrote the Open Society and Its Enemies, which is a seminal work of liberal philosophy, to weaken the ties that had bound society, but which had been but which had basically been taken and used by the Nazis. So those are the ties of religion, the ties to nation and the concept of nationalism, the ties to family and the ties to kin as well. And there was a deliberate effort to weaken them. And in Britain, that came through some of the intellectual ideas of Roy Jenkins, who wrote a famous book in the 1950s called The Labour Case, and also Anthony Crossland, who wrote an even more famous book, the name of which I forget now. Excuse me. But anyway, both of them had the same idea, which was that to make Britain a kind of a left-wing liberal free place, and Roy Jenkins really was the one who pushed this. So when they finally got to power, you had in a single night, you had the legalization of abortion, the legalization of homosexuality, the end of the death penalty, and the introduction of no fault divorce, all in one night. And people said it was the introduction of the so-called permissive society, and Roy Jenkins called it the civilized society. And there was this real effort to weaken those ties in Britain to family, to kin, to nation, and to religion. And we can all think of examples of how that's happened, whether it be the process of secularization, the kind of the mockery of Christianity, whether it be the end of the nuclear family and increasing divorce, or whatever it is. But then there was also in the 1980s, Ian, the flip side of the coin slammed into Britain as well. So, you had Friedrich Hayek, who also believed that the problems in the first half of the 21st century were about kind of community ideas and communalism and a lack of individualism. And he sought to break the control that states had on economies and make life about individual choices, individual contracts. And that came through that ultimately became the kind of the right wing economic liberalism of Thatcher.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what's happened is essentially we've had 80 years of individualism pushed at all levels of society through education, through the economic setup, through the media and socialization. It was just, I'm not saying it was a big conspiracy. It was just the way people thought. It was like the dominant intellectual paradigm of the era. And of course, what's that done, Ian? It's created a society in which self-actualization and personal fulfillment
King.
and yeah, I mean
Even
that's
on
the
the
ultimate,
state's
isn't it?
ticket.
Yeah.
Even on the state's ticket.
Well, exactly. It's like what's going to make me, how many times you hear people say, "Do what makes you happy," do what gives you a bit of pleasure, right? Like
Well,
all
we
of
all
these
want to
things,
be happy, right? I mean, everybody wants to be happy. I'm happy when I'm with my friends. I'm happy when I'm with my kids and my wife and my dog.
right? But
And
here's the thing. Like here's the thing. What happens is if you only focus on your happiness, then before long you don't have a dog because you know what? Sometimes it doesn't. I don't know about you. I'm also a dog owner, and sometimes when it's pouring down with rain, that's actually going horizontal because of the way how windy it is. And perhaps I'm feeling a little bit hungover because I had a couple of too many beers last night. It doesn't make me
Nuki
happy.
Bruins.
It doesn't make me happy to take out Hobbs for a walk, right? That doesn't
Is
make me
that the
happy
name
at
of your
all.
dog?
Hobbs, yeah, yeah,
Only
yeah.
you would have a dog called Hobbs.
Well, it's actually also my grandmother's maiden name, believe it or not.
Well,
So
that's nice. That's a good
yeah,
reason. Good reason.
but he like that doesn't make me happy, but it's a responsibility that I need to have to bring the happiness and the pleasure and the joy of having a dog into my life. That's a great
Yeah.
example of the way it's and equally, sometimes my wife and I quarrel, okay, or sometimes I can't go out on the lash with me mates because I've
She
got
doesn't
responsibilities.
understand you at the time to ditch her over the side.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
well,
exactly.
exactly. Or I can't spend a grand putting a pool table in the spare room, right?
Well, yeah.
Right? Because I've
Yeah.
got responsibilities to look after my wife and to save a bit of cash. But having a wife, that gives me a lot of pleasure in life, okay, and a lot of responsibility and a lot of
And,
happiness ultimately.
and emotional stability. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
exactly. So what I'm trying to argue here in a kind of an analogous and long-winded way probably is to say that, immediate gratification, things that give us pleasure might not bring long-term happiness. And it's this balance of understanding that
Yeah.
when you don't focus selfishly entirely on you, then perhaps you'll have more happiness in life. If you sacrifice a little bit for your wife, your dog, your friends, your country,
Your
your
colleagues,
community,
your
your
country.
colleague, yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
you know
Exactly. Well,
that,
yeah.
and that's what I think that's what we've
That's
missed.
what we've lost. That is what we've lost. And actually that laters right through the kind of political class in Westminster. Because they're all, I mean, I used to joke that not Barrow, Sir Tim Barrow. And actually, let's take Boris Johnson as a better example uh, to avoid impugning Lord Barrow. But Boris Johnson's first three priorities are Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson, and all these kind of careerists that have got to the top with no real work experience, they've got there because they're only interested in themselves. You look at Keir Starmer, you obviously look at people in any of the political parties as well. They're all fundamentally just thinking about themselves and their own personal ambition. And that's just what I think. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that. But I mean,
Yeah, I
it
mean,
goes.
I think it tends to be the case that politicians are quite, tend to be quite conceit. I mean, you've got to have a certain amount of conceit to think that you can run a
Yeah,
country, right? I
that,
mean, that
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 is
comes
that
with the
is true.
territory. But I think at the moment, particularly,
Or personal responsibility or responsibility to your nation. I mean, I don't
well,
think you have to be conceited. Do you think Gandhi was conceited? I don't know. I didn't know. Nelson Mandela, was he conceited? I don't know. I mean, I think you're right.
Yeah,
In
those.
the
I mean,
UK
that's very good.
context,
That
possibly.
is a very good point. That's a very. It's a cliche that's used sometimes, but I suppose the ideal is,
Maybe it's true in the UK. Maybe it's true in the UK that you're precisely proving my point, Andrew.
well, I think I think in the old, I think in the old days, Ian, we did have the aristocratic system, which had a certain noblesse oblige. Like these. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. You have a better education than me, so you might be able to
I'm sure I
pronounce that.
really don't.
So this idea that perhaps they would like to just sit on their estate, going pheasant shooting and do driving their
Did you
sports
say
cars.
pheasant or peasant?
Either or, it depends on the era. But but they had an obligation to help run the state. Like so
Yeah.
you found a lot of the aristocracy. You found them in the senior reaches of the military, for example. You found them as permanent undersecretaries, and you also found them as senior politicians, right? Like that was the concept. But we that broke down, and I think meritocracy is great in many ways. For instance, it's helped me not grow up to be a coal miner, right? Like, which I'm grateful for, and I would have if I had lived in any other era.
Except there are no coal mines left. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, or something similar, right? I don't know, like mud farming or whatever, right? So it helped me not grow up in that way, which I would have. But the the downside of it is that the people who reach the top assume that it's because of their own brilliance,
Yeah.
right? Like at least the aristocrats knew it was just a luck of birth, didn't they?
Yeah.
Whereas the modern elite think it's because of their own brilliance, and there's a certain amount of that in the way that they comport themselves and the way that they govern.
Mm.
There's no concept that, yeah, probably they've been quite lucky in some ways. Not least being born in Britain as opposed to being born on the Ganges Delta, 100
Well,
miles
exactly.
outside Dhaka, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
you wouldn't be living in Knightsbridge if you'd been born there. So I think there is that conceit. There is, and they're not very smart as well. That's another problem. I think about, we're bouncing from one issue to another here, but there's the issue of personal selfishness, which I understand. Like we're all products of this. Like I would struggle to live in a truly socially conservative environment in the same way that people from Afghanistan struggle to live in a truly liberal society. Those are problems, and because we're
Yeah, I
all
mean, there's
products of our
no.
environment.
I mean, there's no. Everybody ultimately has personal needs, right? It's about how you kind of balance that with social responsibilities. I think it's
Of
not about either.
course.
It's not an either or. I don't think. Anyway, I got to wrap this up, mate. So we started a bit late. We should do this. We should do this more often because, frankly, I've got to have this
Please.
discussion for about 4 hours.
Yeah,
Let's have.
as you probably gathered, I could literally talk for 4 hours, no
I
problem.
I
Yeah.
think I think they might be able to talk for longer, but I mean that's not necessarily a bad thing because you have lots of really really good things to say. So no, no, seriously, let's make this a regular thing because this was genuinely interesting. I think that these are conversations that we need to unpack even more, actually,
Yeah.
in the country,
Let's
and
do it
that's
one
what's
by
missing
one.
from politics. Let's do law and order next, maybe.
Okay, it's a deal.
All right, man, I got to go. Just before I wrap up, I just want to say thank you to everybody who follows me. I only started 2 weeks ago and got off to a good start so far, but that's really thanks to the support you've given me. Keep liking and subscribing to this channel and help me continue to kind of talk about important issues which don't get spoken about by the mainstream, mostly in the interest of us all, frankly, living in peace. And wishing you all peace and thanking Andrew, who you didn't see for technical reasons. But thank you, Andrew. Let's do this again very, very soon.
Indeed, yes. Thank you so much for having me on.
Cheers, mate.